Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Nitesh, and in this video we're going to talk about modeling the economic impact of utility damage. So utilities such as water and power supply systems are vulnerable to natural hazards. Natural hazards can cause significant economic loss by damaging structures and infrastructure. In metropolitan areas, the economic losses are primarily caused by building damage. However, in more rural areas, utility damage can lead to higher losses than building damage. Furthermore, utilities typically do not have insurance against natural hazards, and they instead maintain reserve funds or self-insure to recover the damages. However, such funds are often insufficient to cover all the losses. So we need to pay more attention on the economic impact of the damage to utilities, and we need models to predict it. Regional risk and resilience analysis focus on prediction of the damage and recovery, but does not consider the funding sources needed for the recovery. And typical models for the regional economy, such as computable general equilibrium models, only consider the damage to buildings in estimating the direct and indirect costs. So there is a need to better understand the mechanisms and propagation of direct and indirect economic losses caused by utility damage. In this regard, the objectives of this work are to understand the mechanisms that generate economic losses caused by damage to utilities, develop a mathematical formulation to model the significant mechanisms, and then estimate the economic losses that are transferred to the consumer. So here's the outline of this presentation. First, we are going to discuss the mechanisms that generate economic losses caused by damage to utilities, followed by the proposed formulation to model the significant mechanisms. Then we'll go through an example before concluding. We identified three ways in which utility damage and the associated service disruption can cause economic losses. First one of these is that utility damage and service disruption can lead to loss of building functionality and delay the recovery process. However, this mechanism may not be the most significant contributor to economic loss. The reason being that functionality loss due to utility damage is typically short-term, and the delay in the recovery process due to lack of utility services is typically small compared to the total recovery duration. Secondly, utility damage and service disruption can cause high demand in the recovery workforce. However, this mechanism may not be the most significant either, because utilities typically require specialized crews that may not be local, and increases in workforce demand due to the building recovery would cause relatively more significant changes in the regional economy. Thirdly, utility damage accounts for high direct economic losses due to the loss of expensive assets, and funds required to cover such losses can cause long-term rate hikes in the utility services. As discussed previously, utilities typically do not have insurance coverage. So the funds required to cover the losses are sourced from the region served by the utilities through rate hikes, whereas buildings have higher insurance coverage, which means some building related economic losses are actually covered externally. As an example of such rate hikes, PG&E in California has proposed a 19% increase in residential electricity rates, partially due to losses in the recent wildfires. More generally, the number of electricity rate hikes have been increasing steadily since the late 90s. Utilities in the US operate on a cost-plus basis for electricity pricing, and they typically submit a rate case for regulatory approval whenever the current rates are not sufficient to cover the costs. Hazard-related causes have triggered frequent rate hikes, where significant rate hikes have corresponded to either legislation requiring infrastructure improvement, which we can call mitigation actions, such as the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the Recovery and Investment Act of 2009, as well as due to recovery of damages, which may call recovery actions, such as after the Northeast blackout in 2003 and Hurricane Sandy in 2012. We propose a formulation with the following 4 steps to predict the economic losses and rate hikes due to utility damage. First, collect the information for the interdependent systems. Second, estimate the economic costs related to damage, recovery, and liability. Third, model the utility rate case process to predict the rate hikes. And finally, determine the consumer impacts. The rest of this presentation covers steps 1 to 3, while step 4 is subject for future work. First, collecting the information for the interdependent systems. The representation of assets in the interdependent systems requires collecting and integrating data. And we are collecting and integrating data about structures and infrastructures from multiple sources, such as utility companies, insurance companies or organizations, government organizations, published research, and social media. The second step, estimate the economic losses related to damage, recovery, and liability. Here there are models to estimate the direct costs, such as the damage and recovery costs. However, estimating liability costs requires accounting for correlated, networked, and cascading losses. We are developing prediction algorithms to estimate liability costs by modeling interdependencies among systems. Once the costs are estimated, we predict the rate hike proposed by the utility by modeling the utility rate case based on the cost plus pricing. We then estimate the proposed rate for different consumers based on the consumer class and the demand by the class. We consider 3 classes, which are residential, commercial, and industrial. Finally, for the third step, which is to model the utility rate case process to predict the actual rate hikes. After obtaining the proposed rate hike, the estimate for the approved rate hike requires modeling the regulatory approval process. The model for the regulatory approval predicts the approved rate hike based on the economic loss estimate and other utility and region-specific variables. Now for an academic example to illustrate the proposed formulation, we predict the electricity rate hike due to a scenario earthquake in Shelby County, Tennessee. Here we consider a magnitude 7.6 scenario earthquake occurring in the north of Shelby County, and details of this scenario are available from the USGS shake map. For the utility, we consider MLGW, which is the company that owns and operates electricity distribution in Shelby County. We then estimate the damage to the substations and the distribution circuits caused by this earthquake. We perform structural fragility analysis for 92 substations in 60 locations and their distribution circuits using hazardous fragility functions. We estimate that 67 substations would experience slight damage, 19 moderate damage, and 6 would be extensively damaged. Finally, we use the proposed formulation to predict the economic losses and the corresponding rate hike. Here we use damage factors also from hazards to predict the loss percentage for each component. We then use the operating revenue and asset values from the annual report by the utility, and the expected losses come out to be 14.3% of the replacement value of the substations and 2.3% of the replacement value of the distribution circuits. Overall, we estimate this to result in 5.6% increase in electricity rates. Here, a 5.6 increase for a year in an earthquake scenario may not be a cause for concern. However, climate-related hazards with higher frequency and severity would result in higher, more frequent, and longer-lasting hikes. Finally, for some concluding remarks, damage to utilities like water and power supply systems can cause significant economic losses, and due to the lack of insurance coverage, economic losses from utility damage are generally transferred to the local consumers. We developed a mathematical formulation to predict such losses and the corresponding rate hikes in the utility services. And ongoing work is focused on improving the submodels in the formulation and considering other cascading societal impacts. If you have any questions, you can contact me or Professor Gardoni at the following email IDs, and look through other videos if you are interested in regional risk and resilience work. Thank you.